Working the streets, aka the world's oldest profession, has been fraught with formidable adversities. Curiously, this lethal profession, with all its degeneracy, has made heroines out of some of its illustrious patrons, like the only female king of Africa, Ahebi Ubagbi. Ahebi's story is as intriguing as a mystery novel, as inspiring as a mountain peak reaching for the heavens, reminding us of our own potential. That is, if your potential includes being on the game. As a young girl, our heroine had to run away from home because she was about to be married to a female deity as punishment for sins she did not commit. Her village had ruled that her father was guilty of sins that history doesn't tell us, and only his daughter could carry the brunt of the god's anger. Unwilling to be the sacrificial lamb, Ahebi took to her heels and never looked back. Like many call girls of her time, Ahebi resorted to walking the streets to earn a living. But she was wise. Instead of patronizing the local farmers, Ahebi used her charm, poise, and intelligence to attract the high and mighty, like kings and British colonial rulers. She didn't only quench their animalistic tendencies, but learned their language, especially English, which gave her an edge over the local people. Desiring to return to her village, but afraid that she would be forced to serve the immortal village deity, Ahebi hatched a brilliant plan. She led the British forces to subdue the village, and since their local king couldn't speak English, the British installed her king. Now, I know you might see her as a traitor, but her people didn't, and the current generation doesn't. In reality, she's adored in her hometown, and many of their indigenous songs extol her virtues. So you see, it pays to be able to speak more than one language. Remember that next time you're in foreign language class. But it wasn't all rainbows and sunshine for the only female king in West Africa. Her incredible story would require a separate video. So if you'd like me to do a video detailing King Ahebi's glorious rise and abysmal end, let me know in the comments section below. Unlike the Igbos in Nigeria, the ancient Near Eastern societies along the Tigris and the Euphrates practiced religious streetwalking. For instance, the Sumerians ritualized streetwalking, which allowed their kings to sleep with the high priestesses of the goddess of fertility known as Iana. It was an elaborate festival involving sacrifices to the deity and a large banquet filled with all kinds of mouth-watering delicacies. The climax of the festival was when the kings and the priestesses retreated into the secret chamber in the temple of the goddess and quenched their personal burning desires. Their passionate love affair was a recreation of the union between Dumusid, the god of the shepherds, and Iana, the patron deity. The ancient Babylonians also practiced religious solicitation, but in a different context. Unlike the Sumerians, the Babylonian laws required that every woman sit in the temple of Aphrodite and offer herself for at least one stranger in her lifetime. This law was no respecter of class, beauty, or status. Thus, it was common to see women of all classes, shapes, and sizes trooping to the temple of Aphrodite in droves to fulfill this religious duty. Affluent women, who mostly hated this rule but had to fulfill it nonetheless, often arrived at the temple in horse-driven carriages to hide their identities. Their faces were thinly veiled, and they would often disguise their voices to prevent easy identification. Men who desired any of these women would toss some money into their laps and, tend to business, shall we say. But here's the saddest, or most intriguing part, depending on which side of the feminism debate you're on. The value of the money isn't as important as the intercourse itself, and refusing intercourse based on the worth of the money is a grave sin. Thus, any amount was enough for the woman to offer her services. Once that religious duty was fulfilled, she was as free as a bird and could return to her home. If a woman didn't get any man tossing coins into her lap, the law required that she stay at the temple until the man drank from her honey pot. Sadly, ancient records indicate that some women could stay as long as 3 or 4 years because of their uncomely looks. Discrimination exists in all forms, I'm sorry to say, even in the world's oldest profession. Now, while I don't wish to appear to be engaging in the same said practices of our current video, but can I entice you to hit the like and subscribe button without embarrassing either of us any further? Great. Thanks ever so much. Now, both of us can go on about our lives, and unlike religious streetwalking in ancient Mesopotamia, you can enjoy our videos guilt-free and it won't cost you a dime. The ancient Greeks also practiced religious solicitation as an act of worship to Aphrodite, the goddess of love and sensual pleasure. There were two levels of call girls: educated ones who offered premium services, and freed slaves who were available on the fly. Sometimes, temple solicitation was a means of punishment for women deemed to have practiced adultery. These were sentenced to spend a few years or a lifetime at the temple, offering services to men in exchange for money. They often used the money to pay for rites and rituals associated with the celebration of Aphrodite. Ancient India wasn't left out either, as they dedicated prepubescent ladies in ritual marriages to a temple or deity. These women then served as dancers, spiritual guides, and streetwalkers, offering their bodies to the male followers of the deities as part of elaborate rituals to appease the gods. Now, is it just me, or are these gods just a bunch of voyeuristic randy old men? Interestingly, streetwalking wasn't confined to religious practices in ancient times. Men and women were allowed to freely indulge their deepest carnal desires with any girl or call boy they lusted after. For example, men in ancient Rome, regardless of their status, could procure the services of streetwalkers, even male streetwalkers. The only caveat is that they should control the frequency in which they indulge their sensual appetites, or they could fall foul of the law. Brothels were common in Pompeii, and their walls were riddled with fresco paintings of adults satisfying their primal urges in all kinds of positions. Like the Greeks, ancient Rome had two types of call girls: registered, usually called meretrix, and unregistered, often referred to as prostubulae. Of course, the registered streetwalkers were often clean, regulated, healthier, and expensive, while the unregistered were cheap, filthier, and unregulated. So it was sort of up to you. Am I going to the country club or McDonald's? You get my meaning. However, ancient India had a slightly more conservative approach to working the streets, largely restricting it to temples and courts of Indian nobility. The ladies, referred to as tawaif, were strictly professional dancers, poets, and singers who entertained royal guests. However, they wouldn't hesitate to extend their services to the bedroom if they found their guest charming. When the British colonized India in the 19th century, their randy soldiers frequented streetwalkers and sometimes had children with them. However, the practice soon faded after more British women landed on the Indian coast. Turned out the soldiers preferred their own for obvious reasons. Like the ancient Indians, the Aztecs and the Incas of the pre-Columbian era allowed streetwalking only for religious or political grounds. The Aztecs erected special houses for streetwalking called the Cihuacali, where men could go to live their deepest carnal fantasies. The Cihuacali, which translates to House of Women, had several rooms overlooking a central patio, where the goddess of streetwalking is placed. The Inca streetwalkers didn't have special houses, but they weren't allowed to mix with people either. They lived exclusively and were supervised by a government agent to ensure strict adherence to their religious and political roles. Did you know that when you use the term hooker, you're actually referring to this guy? That's right, Union General Joseph Hooker. Now, while the term actually does go back as far as 1845, it most often is linked to the hard-drinking, womanizing general. The legend is that during the American Civil War, General Hooker used ladies of the night to lure unsuspecting Confederate soldiers into being captured. Instead of spending his days chasing after the enemy across the Potomac, he'd much rather use his secret weapon and let the language of love do his fighting for him. The women, often referred to as Hooker's girls or the Hooker Brigade, easily used their charms to get the enemy into a literal compromising position, allowing General Hooker and his men to capture them in their most vulnerable moments. Talk about being caught with your pants down. So it just goes to show wars aren't always won with guns and bombs. Sometimes it's just a wink and a moment in the bosom of a pretty girl, and the rest, shall we say, is history. Curiously, the world's oldest profession appears to wax stronger by the day, though its adherents are suffering adverse health effects. Interestingly, streetwalking and orgies were one of the favorite pastimes of the Roman elite, which I talked about in this video. So give a click on it and I'll see you there. And until next time, thanks ever so much for watching.